Again, this is the second session of the Introduction to New Monasticism course, where we're looking at radical theology. We're doing the work of Slavoj Zizek now. We've just followed up, we just finished up with Jack Caputo previously. Slavoj Zizek's another very prominent figure in the field of radical theology these days. It's very difficult to really get a deep appreciation of the work of Zizek without a familiarity with a wide range of background material. He crosses over a whole number of areas, from modern philosophy, German idealism with Hegel, whole complex legacy of Marxism, as well as contemporary continental philosophy, the work of people like Alain Badiou, including psychoanalysis as well, very important to Zizek, particularly the sort of Lacanian school of psychoanalysis. And he usually unpacks all this with reference to popular culture as well. So he's a very diverse and wide-ranging thinker. I'm going to just start here by talking about the sort of general brushstrokes of Zizek's philosophy through what's called a dialectical negation of the negation, which is his basic reading of the work of Hegel, who's a very prominent figure in modern philosophy. Essentially, Zizek is reading Hegel through the lens of psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis. So we're going to go into a little bit of that in this session, Lacan and Hegel, as well as a number of other different thinkers that we'll bump into along the way. Just to summarize Hegel very, very briefly, before we go and talk about Zizek. For Hegel, the fundamental motor of time and all becoming is a dialectical reconciliation of the members of any binary oppositional pair, in virtue of which one tends to pass into the other in a higher level or a higher unity of synthesis. Now, Zizek has a very heterodox or heretical reading of Hegel. He rejects this idea of a reconciliation of opposites in a higher harmony, and instead proposes what he calls the parallax view, which is very similar to what I've just mentioned as the negation of the negation. Now, the parallax view, which Zizek refers to a constant shift in perspective between 2 points in which there is no synthesis or mediation possible. So think of it as a rejection, or in contrast to this sort of this new age notion of cosmic balance. You've got sort of the yin, yang, light, dark, masculine, feminine, hanging together in harmony and balance, and sort of cosmic sort of unity and so forth. Zizek's parallax view is a rejection of that. And it's based on what he calls a strategic politico-philosophical decision. And it's the decision is to hold the inherent tension between opposing perspectives to open up a gap or a non-coincidence, which makes a thing not at one with itself. So again, this parallax strategy is not to bridge the gap between the two, but to formulate the gap as such. So it's to see an irresolvable tension between two perspectives at the very heart of things. It could also be called an ontological incompleteness in being itself, or being itself is not whole, not at one with itself. Again, in this sense, there is a mutual antagonism without any resolution. And that's all there is. And we just simply have to get used to that. That's what's there at the very heart of it. It's just a fundamental antagonism without resolution, without closure. And this gap, this antagonism, is the parallax. And it simply means that things are not whole. Or from a Lacanian perspective, there is a lack in being itself, a failure of being to ground it or be at one with itself. Again, so there is a structure of imbalance here in the very fabric of things, a painful cut, a principle of irreconciliation, again, or an inherent gap or a non-coincidence of the one with itself. In his most recent big book, I think it's called Less Than Nothing, Zizek summarizes his 700-page manifesto with a very simple phrase that sort of gets at this. He says, the two are not two, the one is not one, and the void is not void. So again, the basic idea is nothing is identical with itself. And it's kind of similar to what we discussed at the end of the Caputo session, sort of the this void of non-identity at the core of who we are, and so forth. Now, I'll try and give a couple of examples of how this shows up in Zizek's philosophy. All right? When it comes to the basic and intractable twosomes or dualisms of Western philosophy, things like mind versus body or free will versus determinism, there's a strong sense in Hegel that we don't opt for one pole against the other, and we don't do the Hegelian thing of looking for a deeper unity between the two. On Zizek's reading, there is a sense in which we only can resolve this impasse not by committing to the fight for one against the other, and again, not looking for some synthesis. However, only by opting for the secondary, derivative, or negative side of the opposition as the first, and as that which constitutes or generates the split between the two in the first place. It sounds a bit complex. I'll give you some examples, all right? When it comes to the opposition between good and evil, just think of the Genesis story and the fall into original sin. Now, the fall into original sin is what they call, what is associated with the knowledge of good and evil. So simply put, the distinction between good and evil is a function of evil. We only start making this opposition or this distinction between good and evil because we're in original sin. So again, simply put, the distinction between good and evil stems from or is internal to evil. Similar way of putting it, similar example, the opposition between law and crime finds its origin in a primordial act of criminal violence. Every social order is founded upon someone who's shed blood with the sword in different ways, one way or the other, in one way or the other. So the distinction between law and crime is internal to crime. Or again, if you read Foucault and his work on madness and civilization, the distinction between reason and madness in psychology and psychiatry is itself an act of madness or internal to madness. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we're at with Zizek's negation of the negation. Now we'll talk about how this impacts Zizek's theology, and what he has as a materialist death of God theology. And if you want to check it out, there's three primary texts that he uses to unpack his materialist theology: the Fragile Absolute, the Puppet and the Dwarf, and there's also one he co-writes with John Milbank called The Monstrosity of Christ. And it's sort of scattered around with publications, but they're the three main ones. In these texts, Zizek develops a materialist death of God theology. That is one where the passion of Christ and his suffering and death on the cross, this is the deepest, most radical core or moment or center of Christianity. Now, at the same time, Zizek is thoroughly materialist. So it's, and in a strong sense, it's not simply that this subversive core of Christianity is only available to a materialist reading. It's not simply that materialism is a privileged, has privileged access to the radical core of Christianity. He's actually saying that a true materialism, if you want to be a true hard-headed materialist, then you actually have to undergo or go through the Christian experience of the death of God. So it really is the death of God and the shattering sort of impact of the crucifixion that Zizek seizes upon here and presses to the very end. So when it comes to the negation of the negation here, and Zizek's sort of parallax view, I suppose, again, we can see that the distinction between the divine and the human. So the old classical old two worlds cosmology, God up here and us down here on Earth, God up there and us down here on Earth. This separation, this gap, this distinction between the two is actually internal to humanity. It's just us mortal flesh and blood humans that make up this distinction between God and us. It's again, it's man-made. With the old two-world cosmology of God up there and us down here, it's man-made. The distinction between the divine and the human is internal to humanity. All right. So, I guess when it comes to the key elements of his understanding of the Christian narrative, we can sort of glimpse them here in what Zizek calls the double kenosis, or where kenosis means the self-emptying of the divine. Again, it's like a negation of the negation. There's a double negation here. Firstly, God the Father negates himself to empty himself without remainder into the world as the Son, as Christ, as the singular sign, the God-man. And this constitutes a kind of a first death, or a first self-emptying of the Father. And that negation is in turn negated in the crucifixion, which is nothing less than where God, the God-man himself, dies. So, and it's this second death that allows the emergence of the Holy Spirit as a kind of revolutionary collective, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this session. In Zizek's Hegelian death of God schema here, we have God's total self-emptying at the incarnation as the first moment, or the first death, and then the self-abandonment on the cross, in the crucifixion, as a second death. This is the foundation of a community of believers. So as we'll talk about a little bit more later on, the resurrection is nothing more than the community of believers, the Holy Spirit, where two or more gather in the wake of the death of God. So in this sense, there's neither the Father nor the Son, but only the Spirit. And that's what constitutes the community. God is nothing but the Holy Spirit of those who believe and gather together. There is nothing behind the scenes backing it up. Again, the central moment here is the what's called the hour of dereliction by the New Testament scholars. That moment of Christ's last words on the cross: "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And as Chesterton wrote, who's a Catholic novelist that influences Zizek significantly here, he said, "We are approaching here a matter more dark and more awful than it is easy to discuss, a matter which the greatest saints and thinkers have justly feared to approach. For at the crucifixion with Jesus, God forsaken howled on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At this point, as we can see according to tradition, darkness comes over the land, the earth shakes, tombs break open, the temple veil is ripped in two, and God incarnate, the enfleshed God here among us, comes to grips with this experience of irreconcilable suffering and doubts the very existence of God, and then dies in the most shameful and humiliating form of death possible. So again, in this tale of the Passion and the terrifying abyss of Jesus' self-abandonment by God, there is a distinct suggestion that the God-man himself, even just for an instant, becomes an atheist and doubts God. And at this moment, the horizon's wiped out. There is the cold, hard truth is exposed, and that no one is coming over the mountain to save us. We are sustained by no overarching cosmic support. Again, God loses faith in God here and confesses the death of God. This is the theological result demanded by Zizek's dialectical maturity, with the negation of the negation. So this is the radical core of the gospel, and it's an ontological scandal. It's an event that throws the very edifice of reality off the rails. And it exposes this, this gap in things, this this non-coincidence in things, this irreconcilable antagonism, as we mentioned earlier. Just to be a bit more clear about this, what we're saying here is that what was going on in Palestine, in Galilee, 2,000 years ago, in Palestine under the Roman Empire, 2,000 years ago, what's going on there is a process in the very heart of God himself. So this is where the creator of the universe takes on flesh and blood and undergoes an agonizing death, loses faith in God, while confessing he is an atheist. So this is the decisive event in God's own self-disclosure, self-communication. God is nothing but this shocking revelation. God is nothing but this tortured body hanging on a Roman cross. So this is the decisive Christian experience, the death of God. And the message here is that we do very well to confront this ontological stand of Christ crucified and live through its inner dynamics rather than just rush straight to the happy ending. For it really is only those who have looked into the senseless nightmare of the world and confronted this existence abandoned by its godless fate, only those who have lived through that experience who can truly see the unexpected gift that we call the new birth, the substantive transformation into a new life that comes about as a result of living through this loss, death of God. So again, this means we need to ditch the notion of God as transcendent, as this otherworldly caretaker who still guarantees that everything's working out according to some orderly plan. And in the same way as this is sort of the death of God as a kind of celestial dictator who resides eternally behind the scenes, or the interventionist God who's up there somewhere and who every now and again intervenes in world history to reward the faithful or punish the wicked, or whatever. So the death of God is the death of this God. The death of God is an name that grounds or stabilizes the meaning of existence. It's the death of this God is also a disclosure that it's a fundamental fantasy. This is transcendent caretaker, celestial dictator. This is a fundamental fantasy designed to cover over the traumatic truth. And the traumatic truth is that this tortured body hanging on a Roman cross is the decisive event of God's own self-realization in history. This all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present God of classical theology, the God of the theologians, is simply absent on the cross, powerless to act on behalf of the innocent victims of human cruelty, and therefore revealed. This God is revealed to us as nothing more than a projection of sort of religious piety. This fundamental fantasy, all it does is conceal, or barely conceal, our needs for also human needs for security and comfort and security and significance and so forth. So, at the subversive core of Christianity is the basic message that to be a Christian is to be someone who has undergone the death of God and the loss of meaning. And it's someone who has experienced and lived through the world abandoned to its godless fate, who is a true Christian in this context. And that means that a true Christian is an atheist, or only an atheist can be a true Christian, in the sense of someone who has undergone and lived through the loss of any fundamental, ultimate ground of existence, God as such, under whatever name. Part of this, the radicality of the Zizek's theology here is that what's going on here is that God opens up. No, there is a gap in what we mean by God. Again, as I said earlier, the separation between God and humanity, the idea that humanity and God are separate, that we're down here and God's up there. That gap, that sense of separation, is something that is man-made. We come up with that. This is the fundamental fantasy that we have constructed for ourselves. However, with Zizek's negation of the negation, what we really get here is a sense of there is a fundamental, irresolvable, irreconcilable gap in the very depths of things. There's a gap in God, in this sense. So this is kind of the radical move. This is one that we've barely ever seen in the history of theology. It sort of stems from the influence of Lacanian psychoanalysis on Zizek's reading of Hegel. And for Lacan, there is this notion of the real as a deep cut in our hides, a profound trauma by which we are constituted. And again, it's the influence of Lacan that gives a place of honour to the power of the negative here, of the negation, and the realisation that it's the cut or the trauma or the irreconcilable gap that's decisive here. So again, there is an original fracture or split or cut in the very heart of being itself. Or in Christian terms, there's a traumatic wound or gap in God. So the gap between humanity and divinity is transposed into God himself. So this means that the very thing that once seemed to separate us from God, suffering, abandonment, death, this is now the very thing that unites us with God. That is, when in our weakness, when we are vulnerable, when we are powerless, precisely then we are identified with Christ as the God-man, as the one who was abandoned and powerless on the cross. As Zizek says, we are one with God when God is no longer one with himself, but abandons himself, internalizes the radical distance that separates us from him. Our radical experience of separation from God is the very feature which unites us with him. Only when I experience the infinite pain of separation from God do I share an experience with God himself, through Christ on the cross. So there's a strong sense here that the cross is a symbol of what's going on in the sacred depths of things. And another way of putting it is saying, instead of having this classical idea of a reality behind the veil of appearances or a supreme being beyond the limitations of finitude and temporality and mortality, what we now have in the crucified and God-forsaken Jesus is an irreducible or paradoxical gap at the centre of God's own self. So again, another way of putting this is to say that the events of the crucifixion discloses the traumatic cuts, the gap, the void in the absolute itself. And this is good news. There is an antagonism or an irreducible gap in the heart of God. This is good news because it's in living through the loss of God. It is living through the loss of our religious consolations and through our own perpetual wrestling with conflicting forces without any resolution, that we participate in a process that is always and already going on within the very heart of God, God's own self. So again, there is a kind of again, to quote Chesterton, there's a secret here that the greatest saints and thinkers have justly feared to approach, and that is the central historical event of the crucified Christ discloses, in a once and for all event, a perpetual wrestling of irresolvable tensions, irreconcilable gap in the sacred depths of the universe. What this means is that the creative impulse at the heart of God is this primordial antagonism without resolution. And it's this that opens up the conditions of possibility under which a new birth is possible, under which new life emerges through the well-historical process. So again, in the radical theology of Zizek, the properly Christian experience is an encounter with the genuine negativity of the absolute itself as an irresolvable tension, as an agonistic gap in the heart of God. And this gap in God reveals the deep ambiguity influence, or the non-existence of any kind of firm, impenetrable ground of reality that we used to traditionally refer to as the name of God. Right. And this means that love and the love of God is bound up with imperfection. So far from being the projection of a purely spiritual dimension towards which we strive to overcome the corruptions of the flesh, at the very centre of the Christ event is something essentially fragile, where we learn to befriend our own frailty, to make the wounds that we have at the very sight of a treasure or a gift. So, just as we really only learn to love another person in and through our openness to their fragility and vulnerability, in the same way, even God cannot be loved unless God is made vulnerable. So we can only love a wounded, vulnerable God. A God that has this gap, this cut, this wound in its own depths. So we are in Christ when we are aware of our fragility, our vulnerability. And the resurrection, in this sense, is nothing but the crucifixion seen differently, seen as a little bit of gift. So, with Zizek's new heterodox reading of Hegel, what we're really trying to suspend or overcome or get past here is the standard religious theological schema in which spirit is first whole, and then it undergoes a loss, and then it's healed or returns to itself. No, the only healing that's available to us, it comes by getting rid of the idea that we were ever once whole to begin with. This is Zizek's parallax gap again. The political and philosophical potential of Zizek's materialist theology is asserted when we renounce all attempts to enact a higher synthesis, and we hold to the inherent tension or antagonism itself as the condition of possibility of real change, dynamism, or transformation. As Zizek himself says, what if the actual problem is not to bridge the gap, but to formulate it as such, to conceive it properly? So again, there is an irresolvable tension or gap in the very fabric of reality. Again, ontological incompleteness is another way of putting this. And there's an inner disturbance at the heart of things that we simply cannot master or extinguish. And just to quote Zizek again in one of his more recent texts, we encounter again the fundamental Hegelian motive. Reconciliation does not convey any kind of miraculous healing of the wound or the cut. It consists solely in a reversal of perspective by means of which we perceive how the decision or cut is already in itself reconciliation. For example, Christ's defeat and infamous death are already in themselves reconciliation. Again, the resurrection is just the crucifixion seen differently. All right. So what we have here is our incompleteness, our lack, our failure or inability to secure a stable sense of meaning and identity. This itself is a generative, productive, positive dimension of our experience. Desire, passion, a deep love for life. It springs up out of this gap, out of this void at the core of our being, at the center of our lives. And again, this void goes all the way down. It's the very edifice of reality itself. It's, there's a gap in God, the irreconcilable cut. And it's generative. It's out of this space that passion and love for life emerges. All right. Now, the death of God, the radical core of Christianity, is also not synonymous with the cure in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And for Lacan, the therapy is over when the patient realizes that there is no big other, which means that there is no social, linguistic structure or symbolic order that is able to secure or guarantee the meaning of our lives, or is able to. There is no symbolic order that can satisfy our need for fulfillment or any sense of self-justification. And it doesn't have to be God. This could be the nation, it could be a political party, it could be a church. The idea is that there is no big other, no gods, no masters. So the radical dimension of Lacanian theory is not simply to see that there is a big cut in ourselves. It's not simply to see that the subject is structured around a lack. It's not simply to see that there is a traumatic cut that is constitutive of our identity. But it goes further. It's to realise that the big other, the symbolic order itself, is also crossed out, barred, cut by a fundamental impossibility. The big other itself is structured around any impossible traumatic kernel or central lack. And it is precisely this lack in the big other which enables the subject to experience that the symbolic order, that which regulates and guarantees the meaning of our lives, hasn't got it. It doesn't have the final answer. In other words, God is dead. Whatever the name of God stands for, whatever it is that secures the ultimate concern. That God is dead. And discovering that God is dead, that the big other itself is barred, lacking, without the answer, the belief system that justifies and secures the subject's self-esteem, whatever it is that we're invested in, collapses. So, put it slightly differently, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are a fantasy we construct in order to answer the question of what the big other wants. And these fantasies we construct are also an attempt to conceal the incompleteness and the inconsistency in things. And psychoanalysis is over when the patient realizes, or when the patient accepts, that there is an absence of any guarantee for completeness and consistency of ultimate meaning and purpose in life. Again, the psychoanalysis is over when the patient accepts the non-existence of the big other. Now, this realization is accompanied by the collapse of the subject's very self-identity, the sense of being, as our identity again is constructed as a response to what I believe the big other was demanding of me. And this is good news, because in discovering that the big other does not exist, there's also a profound relief that leads to a substantive, the chance of a substantive transformation. Lose insofar as I and this along the big other wants to secure my meaning identity. So long as I no longer work on that assumption, I'm free. I'm free from directly the truth of one's desires and passions, which were previously obstructed. So in this sense, we give up the sort of the fantasy of wholeness and completeness, which doesn't exist, and connect with our own lack, our own fragility and vulnerability, and out of that springs forth the truth of our desire, our passion, and other desire. So in this sense, the death of God and the discovery that the big other doesn't exist promotes not the pursuit of a complete and full life in a harmonious society, where wholeness is finally possible, but the exact opposite. So the idea is here that once we strip away the social fantasy that fulfillment in society is possible, once we strip away the fantasy that there is a social order in which I can be whole and complete, we are faced directly with the intrinsic conflicts, again, the irreconcilable gaps and antagonisms that populate all social relations. So we bring to the surface all those difficult, messy, irreconcilable conflicts we have previously been avoiding. So everywhere we look these days, we tend to see all these social, political, and religious movements that dream of harmony and completeness, utopia. And it's these fantasies that usually produce all the horror. So the idea here is that we break the grip of the fantasy, shatter the mirror. The realisation that the big other doesn't exist. It's been done with the fantasies at once and for all, so that the genuine work of building healthy human communities might begin. Now, the process of undergoing the death of God is called subjective destitution. The subject here cuts links with its previous symbolic identifications, or unplugs from the existing order, and therefore acts in a wholly free and self-determining manner. By cutting himself loose from the precious objects through whose possession the big other kept him in check, the subject gains the space of free action. So symbolic destitution, which is the death or erasure of my symbolic identity, involves the sacrifice of the thing, or that idol, that binds me to the dominant ideology, the other. So rather than sacrifice everything for this beloved thing, idol, God, cause that matters more than life itself, subjective destitution involves the suspension of the cause or the thing itself, of that which has given the subject its meaning, justification, identity, and so forth. So it's a kind of symbolic death in which you are deprived of all those strategies and power linkages that support your identity. You are thereby reduced to nothing. However, this is a positive nothingness. But a loss of identity is generative. It clears the space for or place for the creation of something new. It opens up the field of possibilities. The subject therefore cuts ties with or sacrifices that which keeps submissive to the dominant ideology, and we are cut off from the system that we construct and which constructs us. And when we are ripped away from the political, social, and religious structures that define us, we are then finally free to reinvent ourselves, and we're also free, also being ripped away from that which sustains us. So we're free to reinvent ourselves precisely because we are in the grip of those structures that previously defined us. Excuse me. Now, the sacrifice of that which is the subject's, the sacrifice of that which is keeping the subject enchained under the social symbolic order of the law. Again, this is what enables free action and self-determination. This is what enables a new choice of subjectivity. We can reboot identity, be otherwise, the way that we've been constructed or molded to be. Now, what this really means as well, amongst other things, is that this dialectical serious stance of Zizek is not a simple atheism. It's not a negation of theism, as in you see with the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and so forth. The death of God on the cross is the death of that which stabilises or guarantees meaning, truth, and purpose. And it even exposes, this death of God even exposes the religious core that's there in the belief in the big other, that remains even in atheism and humanism and so forth. So Zizek is a more radical atheism. So it shouldn't just be read as a disbelief in God. It involves the dissolution of any subject supposed to know, whether secular or religious or other. Rather than a modern atheism, in which the shadow of the death of God still lingers, in Zizek's positive atheism, the only true belief is belief without any privileged support in the transcendent centre of truth. The only true belief is belief without the authority of some presupposed figure of the big other, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. In other words, to become a true materialist, one must go through the Christian experience, the death of God. Okay? What have we got here? Now, the resurrection for Zizek, and we mentioned this briefly before. Nothing other than the community of believers gathered together in the wake of the death of God. As it says in the New Testament, where two or more gather in my name, I am present. I am Christ. So Zizek explores the notion which stands for a truly non-ideological social order, deprived of any support in the other. As such, spirit reaches its true form in a revolutionary emancipatory politics and psychoanalysis, not in churches. And this means that Christianity must therefore abandon its institutional organisation and engage in a work of creating new forms of community, ones that encourage participants to come together in the work of love and the struggle for justice and hospitality and forgiveness and so forth. Now, the revolutionary practice that Zizek has in mind here are what he describes as a fighting universal. So, again, taking the death of Christ as a point of departure, Zizek outlines the revolutionary implications of this new form of universality that emerges in Christianity and universality. It's not this deep feeling that beneath or behind all the differences we share the same common core universal essence. The fighting universal is the revolutionary collective that emerges through its fidelity to the event of Christ crucified as an event which cuts across all particular or tribal identities and refuses to compromise with any of the pre-existing arrangements of the social and political system. So here, Zizek's true universality is formulated from the position of the absolute outsider, from the position of the excluded. It's a social group that lacks any determinate place in the social order or hierarchy. It's also called the part with no part, or the part of no part. So this fighting universal, it's a collective of those who have no fixed or meaningful place within the social edifice. And it's this, those who have no part in the system, that stands for universality itself, for the human as such. So again, it's a community of those who count for nothing within the existing social order. And Christian love, according to Zizek, introduces this difference into the symbolic order. It's the outcasts of the social order, the beggars, the prostitutes, the despised, and so forth. These are the privileged and exemplary members of the new community, the absolute outsiders, those who are exposed irredeemably to their lack of any fixed, meaningful place in things. So the revolutionary formula of the fighting universal is not so much let us join together and tolerate our differences with everybody. No, we are united in our refusal to tolerate the world as it is. It's where we struggle together with those who are suffering against those oppressive forces that perpetuate the systemic injustice in every civilized culture, in every community. In other words, the universality which emerges here in the emancipatory struggle for justice is that of the repressed, the exploited, and the suffering. It's those who are thwarted in their endeavour to constitute themselves as a recognisable identity. It's the nothings and the nobodies of every culture, the whole trash of the world, to use the phrase from the New Testament. So again, this is not a universality that excludes, but one that is formulated from the point of view of the excluded, of those for whom there is no specific place within the existing order. So it's precisely because this universality is codependent with the lack of a place, the lack of determination, that it is universal as such. It's because they are identified with the nothings and the nobodies, the rubbish of the world. The Zizek here asserts that every believer here has immediate access to the universal as such, in the sense of the absolute outsiders are in touch with the essential fragility of the human condition. They're in touch with the logical lack, the failure of being to be able to constitute around it. That's universal, and it's the absolute outsiders that have privileged access to that experience. And out of that void again is where our passions, our desires, and our love for life springs. So again, by engaging in a life and death struggle, against the power and principalities. The fighting universal therefore actualizes itself in the experience of a negativity, in the inadequacy to itself of a particular identity. And it sort of constitutes, well, again, it's in the awareness of the inconsistency or the incongruity of things that we see this striking universal gather or emerge or galvanise itself. Now, another way of saying this is that it's a community deprived of supporting the big other, as we mentioned before. And in this sense, radical theology, or the task that befalls radical theology, is to form grassroots communities where we can enjoy a sense of belonging and connection in the shared act of undergoing the death of God as a fundamental loss, as an emptying of those things which previously constituted the substance of our life, or in undergoing this experience with the death of God. This is not just another coping strategy. This is not just another way of finding success in the world as it is. This entails the loss of the whole mechanism by which we turn everything into material for our own aspirations for personal fulfillment. So to realise there is no big other is not simply the death of the God of religion. It means the end of any expectation that our existing economic, social, or political institutions will bring our life to its fulfillment at all. And as such, the radical collectives who gather in the wake of God's death offer the possibility of a form of life that isn't endorsed by the system it critiques. Now, naturally, people will react to such an invitation in dizziness or fear or even outright violence. But there are also those precious souls who would respond to this challenge with a passionate love of life without any ultimate transcendent guarantees, in a full-blooded embrace of the world as it is, without the assurances of a big story that makes it all hang together for us. And it's here that we begin to find heaven in the midst of hell, power in the midst of our weakness, wisdom in foolishness, justice apart from the law. And we do so in a world that is both more contingent, more chaotic, and more astonishing than our fears usually permit us to see. Now, I'm not sure how much time we've got left here, so I'll try and touch to a conclusion here. Yeah. There is a clear connection here between the political work of love in this fighting collective and what Lacan calls the death drive, which again is related to this moment of subjective substitution. And it's this death drive that makes a radical freedom possible. It marks the point at which the subject becomes something new and enters a new form of life, or another form of life. So, by suspending one's symbolic identifications, it means that we enter the domain of life deprived of its support system in the big other. And this is like a lethal risk, this symbolic death, but it repeats the possibility of a radically free choice, a choice that is radically free because it's other than the forced choices that constitute our submission to the dominant ideology. So it's also what Zizek calls the gesture of striking at oneself, or the choice to choose the worst is another way that Lacan describes it. So the death drive for Lacan designates the most radical tendency of an organism to bear with a state of loss and lack, or an unbearable kind of irreconcilable tension. The death drive takes things to their highest pitch, and it insists on bearing up under the perpetual sufferings and wrestlings with an irreconcilable conflicts and forces and contradictions and so forth that constitute the reality of our passionate human existence. It's living with the gap at the core of our being that activates the death drive. All right. Now, the death drive here is a source of a terrifying freedom. It's in and through this gesture of negativity that we can clear the way for a new beginning. It's a stripping away. It opens up the space of something new to appear. And it's here, to use Zizek's language, that we encounter the primacy of the inner split as the site of an irresolvable conflict at the origin of all things. It's where one's identity is fractured, inwardly disturbed and cut. It's here that we can reboot a new sense of self from this return to the real of a rupture or trauma. Once we no longer cover it over or fill in that gap at the core of our being, a more radical freedom can emerge. And it's here that there is a different kind of satisfaction and enjoyment that we can find in life. That arises out of the death drive. And it turns on the impossibility or the deadlock or the obstacle at the heart of things that gives birth to our subjectivity. Now, this means that instead of seeking to get rid of that inner sense of strife and disharmony and so forth, impossible, because it is the very constitutes our sense of subjectivity. It's precisely, and it's also precisely this inner disharmony that is the condition for the further emergence of our deep human potentials and so forth. In other words, the death drive presents itself as this solvable antagonism or gap that can never be filled in. And as Andre Van Timlo puts it as a quote here, one is confronted with lack, never being able to fill it in. Desire in the sense of something forever lacking, not in the sense of filling in the lack with fantasies of formulas and so forth. Desire as something forever lacking brings life into motion, engenders a life drive in us, which is called sort of counterintuitively the death drive. Okay. Now, I'll try and summarise now, just briefly. The Christian experience through which one must pass in order to become a true materialist is precisely this traumatic experience of the death of God as the death of the big other. And through this, we can cultivate communities of beings that are bound together without the support of some master name or master signifier and so forth. So it's precisely Christianity here that reveals the impotence and the atheism even through the scandal of the death of God. And in that sense, Christianity is the first and only religion for Zizek to have no hidden or untold story. It's where we are exposed to a loss of identity and a void of meaning. Now, for Zizek, the passage through the death of God leads not to the modern atheism, not the new atheist again, but instead to a more post-modern atheism, or a more positive atheism, an unbelief that sustains the community of believers in a non-ideological sociality of people who come together under the side of the death of God. In a sense, it's a faith that is asserted without reference to God, it's a faith without belief, and it lacks, again, the support of the big other, and it reaches its true form in this fighting universal that Zizek refers to as the form of an emancipatory politics. So Zizek's radical theology supplies us with a frame that would allow us to approach the trauma or of the suffering God. And it's only really a radical theology that can do this. Confessional orthodox theology will always paper it over. Will always cover over the trauma of the suffering God. So today's actually existing churches reduce Christianity to a system of beliefs that grasp and mask the divine as an idolatrous super being that dehumanises us and prevents us from participating fully in material or worldly life. Now, Christianity, for Zizek, can only recover its subversive or materialist core by abandoning its central experience as specifically Christian, the central experience being the death of God. So this experience cannot be contracted down to the particularity of the Christian religious tribal identity or confessional faith. The death of God is the moment in which the non-existence of the big other is recognised, and this momentary flash has the potential to create is fighting universal collective that suspends its members' inscription into any existing confession of religious belief and any ideological order, including the Christianity as a confession of particular belief. So it is possible today to redeem this core of Christianity only in the gesture of abandoning the shell of its institutional organisation. That is the ultimate heroic gesture that awaits Christianity. Is that in order to save its treasure, it has to sacrifice itself. Like Christ, it had to sacrifice himself so that Christianity could emerge in the first place. So we need, therefore, to embrace the idea of Christianity as a tradition that is always prepared to wrestle with itself, to put itself into question, to disagree with itself, and to betray itself. That's subversive core of Christianity, that which can put its own fundamental identity into question. Now, at the end of the computer talk, we discussed A/theism, and this is very similar to what we see in Zizek. This is where you find common ground amongst these two key figures in the field of radical theology. Zizek comes very close to positing a form of Derridean or Computoian faith that appears to touch on what we've again been calling religion without religion, or A/theism. It's a community of the faithful that cuts across all these distinctions between determinate beliefs. This is what Zizek means by the fighting collective. And it's therefore, in many senses, irreligious or faithless with regard to the various determinate particular religions of the world. An A/theistic form of life is where we believe in God without knowing what we believe about God. So we hold the sort of uncollapsible tensions between affirming and putting into question when it comes to any of our religious ideas. So what we really need here are spaces in which participants are encouraged to unplug from the existing ideological order and become part of a wider non-ideological and irreligious political collective by suspending the beliefs and identities that are to be found in their social everyday existence, and thereby gather together around this empty name of a God who is dead, of a God who does not exist. So again, the church that will emerge, or the more radical collectives that will emerge after the death of God, will gather around an absence, not a presence. Will gather around a lack of meaning and identity, in a temporary suspension of disbelief about this gap at the core of our being, in order to receive the gifts of this absence. So what we have here is a desubstantialization of faith in both Caputo and Zizek. It's not so much a positive position that can be held, though. It is something spectral, which means it haunts, spooks all positions. All positions that we hold, including religious and those that are without religion, theism and atheism. So this faith without belief is an affirmation of something fragile, enigmatic, unperceivable and unknown in many ways. Remember that faith without belief is both with and without. It puts into question those with belief, also puts into question those without belief. So the point here is that it's spectral. This Caputo, Zizek, radical community of faith is spectral. It's a fighting collective that is haunted. A spectra haunts the community of believers, and this community is bound together in its response to the events that happen. And our response to the events that happen to us are taken amidst the more radical freedom in which we act and live out of after the death of God. Because it's a freedom without support in the big other, without a guarantor of truth, without a final explanation. So if there is a faith that unnerves the religious and the irreligious, the faithful and the doubters, the theists and the atheists, then our faithful responses to this spectral event will involve learning to live in the between, in the gap, in the tension between theism and atheism, belief and unbelief, memory and promise, insistence and existence between the cross and the resurrection. This tension is generated. It's out of this tension that unpredictable horizons of new possibilities can emerge. So an A/theistic community is one where the faithful consist of both the religious and the irreligious, with both the theists and the atheists. Certainly in regards to the belief systems, we suspend the ultimate determining power of any of these things. The only real difference here that makes a difference as such is not belief, but this unconditional or more universal structure of faith that we talked about with the Pluto. And it's one where we feel our impoverishment, our lack, our incompleteness, and our essential fragility. That's the universal human experience. We feel our naked impoverishment before the radical absence of any foundations. And this is a structure of faith that, again, would never allow for a single principle or perspective to posit itself without itself being subject to its own self-questioning or deconstruction. So an A/theistic community is one that has passed through the death of God, and it's a community that is, in that sense, exposed to the trembling in things. It's bound together by its fidelity to an event that is endlessly retranslatable and reconfigurable. Again, and of course, it finds no support in the big other or any subject supposed to know any ultimate authority out there. No gods, no masters. Well, we'll finish up just briefly by saying that, again, the task that I see going on here when it comes to how to forge new forms of an embodied community and life together. The task here is to create frameworks for new rituals that will help us maintain our fidelity to the events that happen to us, or the events that call us, and thereby, out of this fidelity, we can form new political subjects. The whole idea here is for theists and atheists, believers and skeptics, liberals, conservatives, so on and so on, to join together in a type of political association through the shared experience of a more radical faith, a faith that is without belief in a centered structure, a faith that lacks any pre-given meaning, a faith that has undergone the loss or the death of God as the anchor that guarantees one's meaning and identity in life. This kind of faith is one that can be shared by everybody, no matter what side of the street they're on. Saints or heretics, revolutionaries or control freaks, the faithful and the faithless. So such associations are readily formed across these boundaries. When we have this shared experience of the community of the faithful that is disruptive and unsettling or haunting, when we have this experience that is without any stable meaning or any fixed identity, there's a much stronger likelihood that the associations and relationships can be generative and productive, because we're all sharing in this fundamental loss of any determinate belief and identity and so forth, and then through this more radical faith. It has a gap or an absence at its core. So a more radical A/theistic community would thus be a community that tries to remain true to the promise/risk of those events that happen to us. A community that keeps open these undecidable tensions between faith and doubt, atheism and theism, and a community that lives in the void of meaning between the haunting memory of the cross and the unforeseeable promise of the resurrection. So that's just some introductory thoughts from me about what this might start to look like, this radical theology as it's been lived out. I'm concerned that we may go over time if I talk much longer, so thanks for your attention. I hope it's been at least a little bit enjoyable and meaningful to you, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye. Yeah.